Hi everyone, welcome to the video. This week I am going to talk about drafts and different edits in preparation of a story. I actually had a different video planned for this week, but then I went and finished a first draft and this felt like the perfect time to talk about this topic. My approach to writing drafts is not going to be the right approach for everybody. This is something that you have to figure out as a writer what works for you. But I figured I'd share my way in case that helps anybody figure out what your way should be for you. I tend not to do formal plans. I don't write out a list of scenes chapter by chapter or anything like that. I very much write as I'm going along. I do usually have some ideas of things that are going to happen in the story, but not necessarily the details. So, for example, my Codename Omega series, I know exactly where Jenny is as she's sitting down to tell her story at some point in the future. I know where she is and I know some of the key events that will have to happen in order for her to be in that situation, but I don't necessarily know all of the details. I think of it like going on a journey. And I might know that we have to go to the east of that hill and after that there'll be a river we need to cross. But I don't necessarily know whether the crossing will be a bridge or a ford. I don't know what the path will look like at any given point. I have a few landmarks of key plot events, key story actions. Everything else is figured out as I go along. And this works for me, it keeps it fun. It means as I'm writing my first draft, I'm as keen as any reader to find out what happens next, so it keeps me going. The drawback is sometimes plans change halfway through. When it came to my first novel, Child of the Hive, there is a character called Rachel who I did not anticipate being in the story. I needed a character to give some information to my main characters, and I couldn't just call her the woman for the entire scene, so she got a name. And when I needed somebody else to have this sort of role later on, it made sense to bring back this character I'd already named and introduced. And then she just sort of stuck around and got involved in the plot and got a crush on one of the other characters. And before I knew it, the entire second half of the book just would not work without her. She absolutely has to be there for that part of the book to work, which causes a problem when she just randomly appears partway through the first part of the book. So what I ended up having to do is go back and do massive rewrites of the opening of Child. I had to create new scenes where she was introduced, I had to work her into the plot to make sure she was involved, she wasn't just sort of standing around waiting for her bit to come along. So that first part of the book needed major rewrites to make her fit in it. This is not the only time this has happened. When it came to Shadows of Tomorrow, I thought the main character was going to be Cassie, and the book opens with her joining the Defenders, with her being introduced to the base and the other characters. And then I realised maybe 6 chapters in that Gareth was the one doing everything interesting. He was making the decisions, he was the one that was at the heart of all of the plot. So Gareth was my main character, which meant I had these initial chapters focusing on entirely the wrong person. So I had to go back and basically completely redo those first few chapters. I kept some of the scenes, but I had to write a whole bunch of other stuff in order to make it work. So I have my rough draft, which is let's get the story down, and then sometimes I need to do this major overhaul to fix something that crept in as a problem in the first draft. It's fixing some big issue with the structure of the story, with the focus, making sure that the end of the book fits with the first part of the book. So that I then generally call my first draft. So sometimes there may be a sort of draft 0.1 and then a draft 1, but that is what I generally consider my first draft. So sometimes 2, sometimes actually I don't have the major things to fix, and actually it is just one draft. that's the point when I let somebody else have a look at it. I have another reader who I trust to give me honest advice. And if you're going to give somebody this role, if you're going to ask them to do this for you, it needs to be somebody who understands that the point is to make the book as good as it can be. It may be wonderful to have somebody come in and read the story and go, oh, it's great, it's amazing, I love it, it's fantastic, you're an amazing writer, it's brilliant. But that's not what you need to hear. On the other hand, you don't want somebody who just comes in and says, this is wrong, I don't like this, fix this is a problem, this whole section needs rewriting, just, nah, this is awful, this bit. Because if you got that sort of feedback, chances are you think, oh, well, I might as well give up, just toss this in the bin and carry on. You need somebody in that middle ground who is able to stand there and say, this is what would be necessary to improve the book. You want them to say nice things, but you want them to say, okay, this book is decent, but if you change this, if you made this tighter, if you reworked this part, that's what will make it great. So it's got to be constructive, helpful, useful feedback. You also don't have to agree with all of it. You, as the writer, are in control, and if the person giving you your feedback says something that you don't necessarily agree with, you shouldn't just ignore it. You should listen, you should think about it carefully, decide whether or not you think it applies, but ultimately the decision is yours as to whether you're going to follow that advice or not. And that's when it comes to the second major draft. So here, I often still do some large chunks of rewriting. There may be whole chapters that need tidying up. There may be scenes that get removed because they're not necessary for the story, or I might go in and completely expand on an earlier scene if a character's motivation isn't clear enough. I might go in and rewrite large chunks from their perspective to make that clearer so that when you're reading the book it all makes sense. So there's still quite significant rewrites happening there, but that is what gives you the second draft. I then go and do my third draft, which is a bit more of a tidying up exercise. So this is going through and, okay, this paragraph's a bit wordy, I can trim that down, or this phrasing's a bit clunky over here. Oh, there's 3 million typos that need fixing. It's on a much smaller scale. And then you give it your final proofread before you send it off to anywhere. So this whole process could be a couple of drafts, but it could be 3 or 4. It depends on how much the story needs. And that, I think, is important, that you should give it what it needs. You should take the time. Don't be afraid to do these large rewrites of the story. I think sometimes I've read books that have been self-published where I've just read it and thought, this could have done with another draft. This could have done with fixing up. There's great ideas, the characters are fun, there's interesting concepts, the plot's strong, but there's issues with its structure, or there are parts that are just not clear, not well defined. There are parts where the pacing's off, and that is really sad to read when you're reading this book, that you think, well, this is decent, but it's not great, and actually what it needed was that extra draft. I'm not going to name any names here, I'm not going to shame anybody, because this could just be all my opinion, but there is something deeply sad about reading a book that hasn't quite lived up to its potential. And so my advice is always consider an extra draft. It doesn't necessarily need to be my structure, and there are plenty of writers who spend more time on the planning phase that don't tend to need those big structural rewrites that I was talking about at the start. So if you spend more time planning, you probably need to spend less time rewriting in your drafts. So it comes down again to your approach, what works for you, but always give it another look over. And if you need a second pair of eyes, that is fine too. Find somebody you trust who you can work with and let them take a look at it and give you their feedback. So my first draft of this book is done, but I know there is still a lot of work to be done. I know there's sections in the middle that need tidying up, and I think I could probably do something to increase the tension going into the climax. I've got a bit of work to do, but I'm gonna take a little break now so that when I go back to it in a few weeks' time, I can read through the story and look at it with fresh eyes. I think that's another thing which is invaluable. Allowing yourself a pause. Don't just sort of finish typing the last sentence and then jump back to the start to start editing. Let yourself step away, think about some other stories for a bit, shut off your laptop completely and go do other things. So when you come back at it, you can read it as a reader and see what works and what doesn't work a lot more clearly. So hopefully that's been useful. It's a little bit more generic than some of my other videos, but if you enjoy, please do subscribe. If there are topics you want me to see me discuss, leave a note in the comments and like the video if you liked it. I will see you next week.